The morning Dolores Vásquez paid $3 for a crumbling factory, the man behind the county assessor's desk laughed so hard he had to set down his coffee. She didn't flinch. She was 82 years old, and she had long since stopped keeping count of the times a room had laughed at her. She signed the transfer document in the careful, unhurried cursive she had used her whole life, folded her copy into the inside pocket of her coat, thanked the man without irony, and walked back out into the cold February morning. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had a key in her other pocket. It was heavy and old, iron rather than brass, the kind of key that belonged to a building rather than a door. Her late son-in-law Ernesto had pressed it into her palm 4 months before he died. In the last good hour of an afternoon, when his mind was still clear and his voice still carried the particular steadiness she had always relied on. He had told her the name of the building. He had told her the county parcel number. He had told her that if she ever needed a reason to keep going, she should go find it. She had written everything down on the back of a grocery receipt and tucked it inside her Bible, and she had not looked at it again until the morning after her daughter Marisol asked her, with the careful practiced gentleness of someone who had rehearsed the conversation, whether she had thought seriously about assisted living. That was the morning Dolores went to find the key. Dolores had been born in 1942 in a town in Oaxaca that most maps of the time didn't bother to include. Her father had worked in a textile mill. Her mother had kept a kitchen garden and raised 5 children and made every centavo stretch with the quiet competence of a woman who had learned early that resources were finite and dignity was not. They had crossed into Texas when Dolores was 11, her father's hands already ruined by the machinery, her mother carrying the youngest on her back and a single cloth bag in each hand. They settled in a working-class neighborhood in San Antonio where 3 families shared a 2-flat building, and everybody knew everybody's business and nobody had enough, but somehow nobody went without entirely. Dolores had been a bright girl. Her teachers said so with the particular mix of surprise and approval that told her exactly what they had expected before they met her. She had a gift for numbers, for patterns, for seeing the structure underneath things. Her 6th-grade teacher, a severe woman named Mrs. Aldrich who nonetheless gave credit where she found it, told Dolores's mother that the girl had an engineer's mind. Her mother had thanked Mrs. Aldrich politely and walked Dolores home in silence. They could not afford the kind of future that required an engineer's mind. What they could afford was a careful life, built incrementally, one steady choice at a time. Dolores had married at 23. His name was Felix Vásquez, and he was a good man in the way that certain men are good without making a project of it. He worked in construction. He came home tired and honest. He loved Dolores in the practical, consistent way that doesn't announce itself but proves itself daily over decades. They had 2 daughters. Marisol, the elder, who had her father's steadiness and her mother's eyes, and Renata, the younger, who had inherited what Dolores privately thought of as the restless gene, the one that sent a person always slightly beyond the edge of the life immediately available to them. Renata had died young, 31 years old, a car accident on a wet highway outside of Houston. It was the kind of loss that doesn't resolve. It only becomes something a person learns to carry without being bent permanently by the weight of it. Felix had never fully recovered. He had lived another 14 years after Renata's death, and he had been present for all of them, a good husband, a devoted grandfather to Marisol's children, a man who showed up. But something in him had gone quiet after the accident and never quite came back. He died at 77 of a heart that Dolores believed had simply worked as hard as it was able and then stopped, not from failure, but from completion. After Felix, Dolores had lived alone. This had not frightened her. She had, over a long life, made a careful study of her own company and found it adequate. She kept the small house she and Felix had owned for 31 years on the east side of San Antonio. She tended the kitchen garden her mother had taught her. She attended Mass on Sundays and went to the grocery store on Tuesdays and called Marisol on Thursday evenings, a habit so established it had become its own kind of landmark. She was not lonely. She was alone, which is a different condition entirely, one she had chosen and maintained with full awareness of what she was choosing. Marisol had married Ernesto Figueroa when she was 26. He was a quiet man, a machinist by trade, precise and methodical in everything he did, the kind of man who measured twice before cutting anything, who kept his tools in perfect order, who spoke rarely but meant everything he said when he did. Dolores had liked him immediately and trusted him completely, which were two things that did not always go together. He had been a good husband to Marisol and a devoted father to their 3 children, and over the years he had become something to Dolores that didn't have a clean name. Not a son exactly, though she thought of him with the particular warmth she might have reserved for one. Something closer to a keeper of things. A person who noticed what others overlooked. It was Ernesto who had first told Dolores about the factory. He had mentioned it years ago, almost in passing, the way a person mentions something they've been thinking about, but haven't found the right moment to say directly. They had been sitting in Dolores's kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, eating the soup she made every week from whatever the garden had given her, and Ernesto had said that there was a building on the edge of the old industrial district that he drove past every morning on his way to the shop. He said it had been empty for 30 years. He said it had been a garment factory once, a medium-sized operation that had employed a few hundred workers from the neighborhood before the work moved overseas in the early 90s, and the building had simply closed and stayed closed. The equipment left inside, the parking lot gradually reclaimed by weeds, the windows gone dark. He said he had looked into who owned it and found that the ownership was tangled, a family trust whose beneficiaries had scattered, no single party willing to pay the carrying costs, and no agreement possible on what to do with it. The county had been assessing it for years at a nominal value. The back taxes were modest. He said that one of these days, when the county finally moved to sell it for the debt, the asking price would be almost nothing. Dolores had listened and asked him why he was telling her. He had considered the question for a moment in the way he considered everything. Then he had said that he wasn't sure exactly, only that when he drove past it in the mornings, he thought of her. He thought of the way she saw structures, the way she had always been able to look at something broken and understand what it had been and what it could be again. He said the building had good bones. He had walked the perimeter once. He said he thought it had been well made, the original construction honest and solid under all the years of neglect. He said a person with the right kind of eyes could see it. Dolores had said that she was 68 years old and had no business buying abandoned factories. Ernesto had smiled the rare, quiet smile that meant he was filing something away rather than abandoning it. He had brought it up twice more over the following years, always the same way, gently, without pressure, as though he were tending something that needed time rather than urgency. And then he had gotten sick. The diagnosis came when he was 64, a cancer that announced itself too late and progressed too fast, and the remaining months were consumed with the specific terrible business of that kind of ending. There had been no more conversations about the factory until the last good afternoon. It was October, and the light in the hospital room had the quality that October light sometimes has, warm and slightly elegiac, the particular gold of things that are ending, but ending beautifully. Ernesto's mind had been clear that day in a way it had not been for weeks, and he had asked to speak with Dolores alone. Marisol had stepped out to get coffee she didn't need, and Dolores had sat beside his bed and taken his hand, which was thin now and cool, but still held the particular shape of itself, still recognizably his hand. He had told her about the factory in a way he had not before. Not the building exactly, but what was beneath it. He said that 2 years before his diagnosis, during a period when the ownership dispute had finally been resolved and the county had agreed to a tax sale, he had gone inside. He had known a man on the city's code enforcement team who had let him in with the understanding that he was assessing the structure for potential purchase. He had spent 3 hours in the building with a flashlight, moving through the old production floor, the storage rooms, the basement level. He had found something in the basement. He told her carefully, in the measured way he always used for things that mattered. He told her what it was and where it was and why he hadn't said anything until now. He told her it had been 30 years in the making and that it was exactly the kind of thing that would have been missed by every person who had ever looked at that building with contempt or indifference, because they had only looked at what was visible. Then he had given her the key and the parcel number and told her to go when she was ready. He had said she would know when she was ready. She had not been ready for 4 months. She had not been ready until the morning her daughter asked her gently about assisted living. The county tax sale listed the factory parcel at $3. Dolores had read the listing twice to be sure she was reading correctly. The building was described as a derelict industrial structure of approximately 18,000 square feet on a 0. 9-acre lot in a low-value corridor of the old manufacturing district. It was noted as having sustained water damage, broken window glazing throughout, and no functioning utilities. The county wanted the back taxes cleared and the liability off its books. $3 accomplished that. Nobody else had bid. Dolores paid in cash. She kept the receipt. She drove to the building the following Saturday morning, alone, before the light had fully established itself, because she had always thought more clearly in the early hours before the day developed opinions about itself. She parked on the cracked concrete apron in front of the building's main entrance, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment looking at what she had purchased. It was large and low and old, built in the 1940s from the look of the brick, solid construction from an era that understood that buildings were meant to last. The brick was dark with decades of soot and weather, but structurally present. No visible crumbling, no sections collapsed. The windows were boarded on the ground floor, broken on the second. The loading dock doors along the east side were rusted shut. Weeds had come up through every crack in the concrete around the building, and a stand of opportunistic trees had established themselves against the north wall, their roots working quietly at the foundation. It looked like nothing. It looked like the end of something that had already been forgotten. Dolores got out of the car. The morning air was cold and smelled of winter coming, that particular dry mineral smell of Texas in February before the warmth reasserts itself. She stood in front of the building and looked at it the way Ernesto had said she would look at it, with the right kind of eyes, the ones that saw structure rather than surface, possibility rather than present condition. She could see that it had been well built. The mortar lines were still true. The roof line, though worn, had not given way. The bones were good, exactly as Ernesto had said. She put the iron key in the padlock on the main entrance, and it turned with a heaviness that spoke of age but not of failure. The door swung inward. The darkness inside smelled of dust and old machine oil and something else underneath, something she couldn't name yet. She turned on her flashlight and stepped inside. The production floor was vast and dim, the boarded windows filtering the morning light into thin cold strips. The equipment was still there, rows of industrial sewing machines gone to rust, cutting tables pushed against the far wall, rolling racks that had once held finished garments now empty and tilted. There was a layer of dust over everything that was both thick and undisturbed, the dust of complete abandonment, the kind that settles when no one has been present to stir it. 30 years of silence made visible. Dolores walked slowly through the production floor, her flashlight moving across the machines, the tables, the walls. Someone had painted a mural once along the east wall, workers at their stations, hands moving over fabric, a horizon visible through a suggested window at the mural's edge. The paint was faded and in places flaking away, but the composition remained. She stood in front of it for a moment. The figures in the mural had the specific dignity of ordinary people recorded by someone who believed they were worth recording. She found the basement stairs at the back of the building, behind a foreman's office that still had a desk in it, and a calendar on the wall frozen at August 1991. The door to the stairs was not locked. It stood slightly ajar, as though someone had been through it recently, or simply as though the building had been breathing slowly all these decades and had exhaled this door to a position of rest. Dolores went down the stairs carefully, one hand on the railing that was still solid, testing each step before she trusted it. The basement opened around her as she descended, wider than she had expected, the ceiling low but the space extending far beyond what the footprint of the building's entrance had suggested. The smell was stronger here, machine oil and something else, something she was starting to identify as she moved the flashlight across the space. Cedar, and beneath it, something that smelled like time itself, like a place that had been keeping its own temperature and its own air for a very long time. The flashlight beam found the first one along the south wall, a shape under a canvas covering, long and low, the canvas thick with dust. She crossed to it, lifted one corner. The wood underneath was extraordinary. She stood very still, looking at it. Then she found the next one, and the one after that, and she kept moving through the basement with her flashlight, lifting canvas after canvas, and with each one the picture that Ernesto had described in his hospital room became not just real, but larger than he had told her, more than he had told her, or perhaps exactly what he had told her, and she simply had not had the capacity to fully imagine it until she was standing in the middle of it, surrounded by 30 years of hidden, patient. Extraordinary work. She sat down on the bottom stair when she had finished looking. She was 82 years old, and her knees were speaking to her in the way they always did in cold weather, but she sat on that stair for a long time regardless. The flashlight rested on her knee, casting its beam up at the low ceiling. Around her in the darkness, invisible now but fully present in her mind, was the thing Ernesto had found and had known, with the particular quiet certainty that had defined him, was meant for her. She did not cry. She thought about crying and decided against it. Not from suppression, but from the sense that this moment deserved something steadier than tears. She sat with it instead, the way she had learned to sit with the large things in her life. Quietly, fully, without rushing toward what came next. Then she stood up, straightened her coat, and climbed back up the stairs. She had work to do. The first person she told was her neighbor Cleo. Cleo Brathwaite was 79 years old and had lived next door to Dolores for 22 years and had, in that time, become the kind of friend that defies the usual categories. Not family, not quite, but present in the way family is supposed to be and sometimes isn't. She had brought food after Felix died. She had sat on the porch with Dolores through the long summer after Renata, not talking, just sitting, which had been exactly the right thing. She was a practical woman with a sharp mind and no patience for performance of any kind, which meant Dolores trusted her in the specific way you trust someone who has never once told you what you wanted to hear when the truth was available. Dolores called her from the car in the factory parking lot, still, sitting in the February cold with the engine off, the iron key on the seat beside her. "Cleo," she said when the call connected. "I need you to come see something." "Is it an emergency?" Cleo said. "Because I'm in the middle of my program." "It's not an emergency, but I need you to come." A pause. "Are you all right?" "I think so," Dolores said. "I think I might be better than all right. But I need someone else to look at it before I decide what I'm looking at." Cleo arrived 40 minutes later in her daughter's car, which she had borrowed without asking, wearing her good coat and the expression of a woman who had decided on the drive over that whatever this was, she was going to take it seriously. Dolores walked her through the main floor first, the same slow path she had taken herself, the flashlight moving over the rusted machines and the faded mural and the 30 years of accumulated quiet. Cleo walked beside her without speaking, which was unusual enough that Dolores noticed it. Then she took her down the basement stairs. She lifted the canvas covers one by one while Cleo held the second flashlight Dolores had thought to bring from home. And Cleo, who had not been rendered speechless by anything in recent memory, said nothing for a long time. What they were looking at, spread across the basement of an abandoned garment factory that the county of Behar had just sold for $3, was furniture. Not ordinary furniture. Not the kind of thing that ends up in a salvage warehouse or a discount showroom or a storage unit full of someone's unwanted past. What filled the basement of that building, under 30 years of canvas covering and careful darkness, was handmade furniture of a quality that belonged in a museum. Chairs with joinery, so precise it looked machined. Tables whose surfaces, when Dolores wiped away the dust with the hem of her coat, revealed wood grain of extraordinary depth and color. A roll-top desk with working mechanisms, every drawer sliding clean and true. Cabinets whose doors hung perfectly plumb after 3 decades of waiting. Beds, wardrobes, sideboards, rocking chairs, blanket chests, mirrors framed in hand-carved wood that depicted patterns Dolores recognized from the textile traditions of the region, the same patterns that had been woven into the fabric processed in the factory above for 50 years before the work moved away and the building went dark. Cleo finally said, "Who made all this?" Dolores had been thinking about that since she came back up the stairs the first time. She had been turning over what Ernesto had told her in the hospital room, filling in the gaps with what she was seeing now, assembling the picture the way she had always assembled things, patiently, from the edges in. There had been a man, she said. Ernesto found out about him when he went through the building 2 years before he died. His name was August Reyes. He had worked in this factory from 1967 until it closed in 1991. He ran one of the cutting stations. Ernesto said the people who remembered him said he was the best craftsman on the floor, that his cuts were always exact, that he never wasted material, that he had a feeling for the properties of things, how they wanted to move, and where they would hold. She moved the flashlight slowly across the nearest piece, a low table with legs that tapered in a way that looked almost effortless, but which she understood, now, required an extraordinary degree of skill to execute. When the factory closed, she continued, August didn't leave right away. The ownership was already in dispute. Nobody was watching the building. He had a key because he'd been responsible for locking up at the end of shifts. And he had, apparently, a plan. He came back, Cleo said quietly. Every day for years, Dolores said. From what Ernesto could piece together from the people who had known him, August Reyes spent the first year after the factory closed setting up a workshop in the basement. He brought his own tools. He sourced his own wood. The loading dock on the east side could be opened from inside, and he used it to bring in materials at hours when the street was empty. He worked alone. He told nobody what he was doing. How long did he work here? Ernesto thought approximately 15 years. Maybe more. The last pieces have dates carved underneath them if you look. She crouched beside the nearest cabinet and angled the flashlight beneath it. There, in the bottom corner of the underside, were 4 small numbers carved into the wood with a tool that had been used with precision and care. 2006. He stopped in 2006, Dolores said. Or at least that's the last date on anything down here. She straightened slowly. He died in 2009. He had no children. He had a sister in Laredo who had predeceased him. What happened to him at the end, whether he meant for any of this to be found, whether he knew it was still here, Ernesto didn't know. Nobody seems to have known about this room. Not the ownership trust, not the county, not anyone who looked at this building as a tax liability and saw only what was on the surface. Cleo was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Dolores, do you know what this is worth? Dolores did not know exactly, but she had looked at enough of the pieces in the past 2 hours to understand that she was not standing in a room full of hobbyist work or amateur attempts. She was standing in a room full of masterpieces, the kind that collectors paid serious money for, the kind that ended up in galleries and auction catalogs and the permanent collections of museums that cared about American craft. I know it's worth more than $3, she said. Cleo laughed, a short and genuine laugh that echoed strangely in the low-ceilinged basement. Then she looked around at the covered shapes, extending into the darkness beyond the reach of their flashlights, and her expression settled into something more serious. What are you going to do? Dolores said. I'm going to find out what it is before I decide what to do with it. She was, as she had always been, methodical. The first call she made the following Monday morning was to a woman named Patricia Solis, who taught art history at a university in San Antonio, and whom Dolores knew through the parish council, where Patricia sat on the arts committee and Dolores had served on the finance committee for 11 years. They had shared a table at exactly the kind of long church meetings that create either resentment or friendship, and in their case had created the latter. Patricia was 53, meticulous, and constitutionally unable to overstate anything, which made her the right person to call when you needed to know what you were actually looking at. Dolores described what she had found without embellishment. She gave Patricia the dimensions of the pieces she could estimate, the joinery styles she could identify, the wood varieties she recognized, the carved dates. She described the mural upstairs and the factory's history. She did not speculate about value. She simply described. Patricia was quiet for a moment after Dolores finished. Then she asked 3 questions in rapid succession. What is the address? Can I come this week? Have you told anyone else yet? Dolores gave her the address. Said Thursday would work. Said she had told Cleo and no one else. Good, Patricia said, and there was an urgency in her voice that she was working to moderate and not entirely succeeding at. Don't tell anyone else until I've seen it. Not yet. Patricia arrived on Thursday morning with a colleague from the university's studio arts department, a man named Dr. Chun who specialized in American vernacular furniture traditions and who walked through the basement of the factory with the expression of a person who had spent a professional lifetime preparing for exactly this kind of moment and still found himself unprepared for it now that it had arrived. He spent 4 hours in the basement. He photographed every piece. He measured joinery gaps with a tool he had brought in a soft case. He examined wood grain with a small magnifying glass. He crouched under tables and opened every drawer and ran his fingertips along every surface with the focused attention of someone reading a language through touch. When he came back upstairs to where Dolores was sitting in the old foreman's office with coffee from the thermos she had brought, he sat down across from her and placed his hands flat on the dusty desk and looked at her with an expression that was both professional and, she thought, slightly overwhelmed. Mrs. Vasquez, he said, do you know the name George Nakashima? She did not. He was one of the most significant American furniture makers of the 20th century, Dr. Chen said. He worked in the Japanese craft tradition in Pennsylvania from the 1940s until his death in 1990. His pieces sell at auction for tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes hundreds of thousands. Because the work is extraordinary and because there is a finite amount of it, and because the people who understand craft understand that what he made was not furniture in the ordinary sense. It was an argument about what human hands are capable of when they are guided by absolute mastery and complete commitment. He paused. What August Reyes made in this basement is not the same as Nakashima's work. It comes from a different tradition, a different set of influences, a different aesthetic logic. But the level of skill, the precision, the understanding of material, the consistency across 30 years of solitary work. Mrs. Vásquez, I have been studying American furniture for 26 years. I have never seen anything like this from an unknown maker. Not once. Dolores looked at him steadily. What is it worth? Dr. Chen glanced at Patricia, who gave him a look that said, answer the question honestly. I can't appraise it, he said. That's not my role. You would need a certified appraiser who specializes in American craft furniture. But I can tell you what I would tell a colleague at any major institution if I described what I've seen today. I would tell them to move quickly. Because pieces of this quality, with this quantity, from a single unknown maker with this level of documentation available about his life and work, this is the kind of discovery that appears once in a generation. If that. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The appraiser's name was James Whitfield. Patricia found him through a colleague at a museum in Houston. He was 61, a lean, precise man who spoke sparingly and looked at everything twice before he commented on it once. He came the following week with an assistant and spent 2 full days in the basement, cataloging every piece with photographs and measurements and detailed condition notes entered into a tablet he carried everywhere. On the second evening, he sat in the foreman's office with Dolores and Cleo, who had appointed herself a permanent presence in these proceedings with a matter-of-factness that Dolores found both unnecessary and deeply comforting. James Whitfield opened his tablet and turned it so Dolores could see the screen. He had organized the inventory into categories: seating, tables, storage, bedroom furniture, decorative pieces. The numbers beside each category were estimates, ranges rather than fixed values, reflecting the uncertainty inherent in work by an unknown maker entering the market for the first time. She read the totals at the bottom of the screen and read them again. Then she looked up at him. Those are preliminary estimates, he said. The final appraisal will require additional research into comparable sales and some consultation with colleagues. The range could move in either direction, though in my experience with discovered work of this quality, it tends to move upward once the provenance is established and the maker's story becomes known. The preliminary total he had entered was between $1.4 and $2.2 million. Dolores sat with that number for a moment the way she sat with all large things. Quietly, without rushing toward its implications. She thought about Ernesto, lying in the hospital room in October light, telling her about a building he drove past every morning, telling her it had good bones, telling her she had the right kind of eyes. She thought about August Reyes, coming back to a closed factory every day for 15 years with his tools and his wood and his absolute commitment to making something extraordinary in a place the world had decided was finished. Working alone in a basement while the city moved around him and the building above him accumulated 30 years of dust, and the county added it to a list of tax liabilities, and nobody thought to look below the surface. She thought about her father's hands, ruined by machinery. She thought about her mother's kitchen garden. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge saying she had an engineer's mind and the particular shape of that compliment, the surprise in it, the assumption underneath the praise. She thought about Marisol asking gently about assisted living with the careful, rehearsed gentleness of someone who had already made up her mind. Mrs. Vásquez, James Whitfield said, "Are you all right?" She was 82 years old, and she had just bought a building full of masterpieces for $3 because a good man who loved her family had driven past it every morning for years and thought of her. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." She asked him what the next steps were. He told her. Authentication documentation, provenance research, market positioning, decisions about whether to sell through auction or private placement or institutional acquisition or some combination. He told her the process would take time, several months at minimum, and that she should retain legal counsel and a financial advisor before making any decisions. She thanked him and said she understood and asked him to send her the preliminary report when it was ready. After he left, Cleo poured the last of the coffee from the thermos and handed Dolores a cup and said nothing for a while, which was its own kind of statement. Then Cleo said, "You're going to have to tell Marisol." "I know," Dolores said. "She's going to feel terrible about the assisted living conversation." "I know that too. Are you going to make her feel terrible about it?" Dolores considered this. "No," she said. "She was trying to take care of me. She just had the wrong idea about what taking care of me looked like." Cleo nodded. "When are you going to tell her?" "Soon," Dolores said. "But first I want to do one more thing." "What's that?" She set down the coffee cup and looked at the door to the basement stairs. "I want to find out everything I can about August Reyes," she said. "Before I decide what happens to his work, I want to know who he was." It took her 3 weeks. She was methodical about it, as she was about everything. Working in the mornings at the kitchen table in the foreman's office with a yellow legal pad and her reading glasses and the particular focused patience that had served her whole life. She made calls. She sent letters. She drove twice to the county records office and once to the public library's archive room. She talked to 4 people who had worked in the factory during the years August Reyes had been there, elderly now, located through a combination of the church directory, Cleo's considerable neighborhood network, and a phone call to a retired union representative who still kept records from that era. What she assembled, piece by piece, was a portrait of a man she had never met but whom she came to understand with the particular intimacy of sustained attention. August Reyes had come to San Antonio from a small town in Coahuila in 1964 at the age of 22. He had found work at the factory through a cousin who was already employed there. He had been, by every account of people who remembered him, extraordinary at his work in the specific way that extraordinary craftsmen often are. Not flashy, not fast, just precise. He cut fabric the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, with full respect for the material and complete confidence in the instrument. The foreman had recognized his ability and given him increased responsibility over the years, though never the kind of recognition or compensation that the ability warranted, which was a story so common in those rooms and in that era that none of the people Dolores spoke to mentioned it as remarkable. He had lived simply. A rented room for 20 years, then a small apartment. He had sent money home to his mother until she died. He had attended Massachusetts. He had kept to himself without being unfriendly. He had not married. Nobody could tell her whether that had been by choice or by circumstance, and she did not press the question. What 2 of the former workers remembered, and what neither of them had connected to anything larger until Dolores asked her careful questions, was that August had been a woodworker before he came to San Antonio. His father had been a carpenter in Coahuila, and his grandfather before that. He had grown up with wood the way other children grew up with words, as the primary medium, through which understanding moved. He had brought his father's tools with him when he came north. He had kept them in his room, then his apartment, oiled and ordered, for 27 years before the factory closed and gave him a place to use them. One of the women Dolores spoke to, a former seamstress named Ophelia who was 84 and still sharp and who had worked 2 stations down from August for 17 years, said something that stayed with Dolores for a long time after she wrote it down. She said that in the last years before the factory closed, August had seemed different. Lighter somehow, she said, was the word she used. Lighter. Like a man who had found something to look forward to. Like a man who knew something the rest of them didn't know yet. When the closing was announced, most of the workers had been devastated. Some had been angry. August had been sad for them. She could see that, but he had not been afraid. He had packed his tools on the last day with the careful attention he gave to everything and carried them out to his car and driven away, and she had not seen him again after that. Until one morning about 3 years later, she said, when she had been driving past the old building on her way to her sister's house and had seen his car parked in the lot at an early hour and had thought that was strange, had thought maybe he was checking on the building for someone, and had not thought about it again until Dolores's phone call, 40 years later, had given her a reason to. Dolores wrote all of it down. She wrote August's life in the margins of what she was discovering in the basement, the man alongside his work, the decades of solitary intention alongside the masterpieces that intention had produced. When she was done, she had 14 pages of notes and a clarity about what she wanted to do that felt less like a decision than a recognition of something she had already known. She called Patricia Solis. "I want to keep the building," she said when Patricia answered. "All of it. All of it. I want to restore it. I want to create something permanent here." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant undertaking," she said carefully. "At your age, with the resources required." "I know," Dolores said. "I'm not asking you to tell me whether it's practical. I'm asking you to help me figure out how." Another pause. Then Patricia said, "Tell me what you're thinking." Dolores told her. The plan she had been assembling in the mornings on her yellow legal pad was not a simple one, but it had the quality of all well-constructed things. It was clear in its logic. Each element supported the others. The joints held. She would sell a portion of August's pieces, enough to fund the restoration of the building and establish an operating endowment. Not all of them, not most of them. Enough. Dr. Chun had already identified 12 pieces that he believed would perform exceptionally well at auction, pieces whose quality was so singular that even without an established market for August Reyes's work, they would create their own demand. James Whitfield agreed. The 12 pieces alone could generate, conservatively, between $400,000 and $600,000. With that, she would restore the factory, not to its original industrial configuration, but to something that honored what it had been while making space for what it could become. The production floor, with the mural, would become a gallery for August's remaining work, a permanent collection displayed in the building where it had been made, in the neighborhood where the maker had lived his life. The basement workshop would be preserved as it had been, with August's tools and his workbenches and the ordered precision of his space, a record of how the work had been made. And the upper floor, which had been offices and storage, and which had good north-facing light that the boarded windows had been hiding for 30 years, would become a workshop. A working one. A school of craft, free or subsidized, for young people from the neighborhood whose grandparents had worked in this building and whose own hands might be waiting for the right kind of instruction and the right kind of space. Patricia listened to all of it without interrupting. When Dolores finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to help you build this." "I know," Dolores said. "That's why I called you." The conversation with Marisol happened on a Thursday evening, because Thursday evenings were when they always talked, and Dolores saw no reason to change the rhythm of things simply because the content was going to be different. Marisol answered on the second ring. Her voice had the careful warmth it always carried these days when she spoke to her mother, the warmth of someone monitoring for signs of decline without wanting to appear to be monitoring. Dolores had noticed this for 2 years and had found it equal parts touching and maddening. She let Marisol ask how she was. She said she was fine. She said she had something to tell her and that she wanted to tell it from the beginning so that Marisol would understand it properly. She told it from the beginning. Ernesto's kitchen table conversation. The grocery receipt in the Bible. The morning after the assisted living conversation. The county assessor's desk. $3. The iron key. The basement. Marisol did not interrupt. Dolores could hear her breathing, could hear the quality of her silence shifting as the story developed, the careful monitoring warmth giving way to something rawer and more genuine. When Dolores described coming down the basement stairs with the flashlight and finding the first canvas-covered shape along the south wall and lifting the corner and seeing what was underneath, Marisol made a sound that was not quite words. Just a sound, the kind that comes from a place below language. "He knew," Marisol said finally. Her voice was thick. "Ernesto knew, and he saved it for you. He said I had the right kind of eyes," Dolores said. Marisol was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very carefully, "Mama, I'm sorry about what I said. About the assisted living." "I know," Dolores said. "I was scared. I was worried about you, and I handled it wrong." "I know that too," Dolores said. "You were trying to take care of me. We just have different ideas about what that looks like." She could hear Marisol crying quietly on the other end of the line. She let her. Some things needed their time. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked after a while. "With all of this?" "It's a lot, Mama," Marisol said, and laughed through the tears in the way she had laughed since she was a small girl, with her whole chest, with no self-consciousness at all. "You just told me you bought an abandoned factory for $3 and found $2 million worth of handmade furniture in the basement, and you're asking if I'm going to be okay?" Dolores smiled. I'm asking if you want to come see it. She heard Marisol take a breath. When? Saturday morning, Dolores said. Early. Bring the children if they want to come. I'll bring the good thermos. The building had been waiting 30 years for someone to come back to it. Dolores figured it could wait until Saturday. Marisol arrived Saturday morning before the light had fully settled, which told Dolores everything she needed to know about the state of her daughter's mind. Marisol was not an early riser. She never had been, not since childhood, when Dolores had needed to call her 3 times before she would surface from sleep with the particular reluctance of a person who found the world before 8 in the morning personally offensive. The fact that she was standing in the factory parking lot at 7:15 with a thermos of her own and her eldest son Tomas beside her, both of them looking up at the building with wide and serious eyes, meant that she had likely not slept. Dolores unlocked the padlock and pushed the door open and let them in. She did not narrate. She had learned, over a long life, that some things explain themselves better without commentary, that the right kind of silence gave people room to arrive at their own understanding rather than inheriting someone else's. She walked them through the production floor the same way she had walked herself through it on that first February morning, slowly, the flashlights moving across the rusted machines, and the faded mural, and the 30 years of ordered quiet. Tomas stopped in front of the mural for a long time. He was 34, an architect, which still struck Dolores occasionally as the particular shape of a life choosing its own form. He had his grandfather Felix's hands and his grandmother's eyes, and he stood in front of the painted workers with the focused attention of someone who understood that whoever had made this had meant something specific by it and deserved to have that meaning received carefully. He said, "Who painted this?" Dolores said she didn't know yet. It was on her list. He nodded and kept looking. Then he took out his phone and began photographing it with the systematic thoroughness that told her he was already thinking structurally, already measuring in his mind what it would take to preserve this. She took them down the basement stairs. Marisol made a sound at the bottom of the stairs, before Dolores had lifted a single canvas, just from the smell and the scale of the space and the shapes visible under their coverings in the beam of the flashlights. A small involuntary sound, the kind that comes before the mind has caught up with what the senses are already reporting. Dolores lifted the canvases one by one. By the 4th piece, Tomas had put his phone away. He was touching things now, running his hands along the joinery the way Dr. Chun had, with the focused reverence of someone who built things and understood the cost of this level of precision. He crouched beside a blanket chest and examined the dovetail corners and stayed there for what felt like a full minute without speaking. By the 8th piece, Marisol was crying. Quietly, without drama, the way Dolores had always cried and Marisol had apparently learned. She stood in the middle of the basement with her arms crossed and her flashlight pointing at the ground and the tears running down her face in silence. Dolores stood beside her and did not say anything. After a while, Marisol said, "He came back here every day." "Yes," Dolores said, "for 15 years. Approximately." Marisol looked around at the covered shapes extending into the darkness. "Alone, as far as anyone knows." Marisol pressed her lips together. She had the particular expression she wore when she was trying to understand something that kept expanding every time she thought she had its edges. "Your father used to say," she said slowly, "that the people who worked in places like this, who did work like this with their hands, were the most underestimated people in any room. He used to say that the economy was organized to make their work invisible while depending on it completely." Dolores looked at her daughter. She had not expected that. Marisol did not often speak about Ernesto directly, in the particular present tense way that referenced things he used to say. It had been 18 months since his death, and she was still, Dolores knew, working out how to carry it. "He was right," Dolores said. Marisol wiped her face with the back of her hand. "What are you going to do with all of this?" Dolores told her. She laid out the plan the same way she had laid it out for Patricia, methodically, from the foundation up. The partial auction to fund restoration. The gallery for August's permanent collection. The preserved basement workshop. The craft school on the upper floor. She told it without embellishment and without apology, in the voice she used for things she had already decided. Marisol listened to all of it. When Dolores finished, Marisol looked at Tomas, who was still moving through the basement with his flashlight, measuring things with his eyes, making the small sounds of a man whose professional imagination had been fully engaged. "Tomas," Marisol said, She's going to need an architect. He looked up. He looked at the space around him, at the low ceiling and the solid walls and the 30 years of hidden extraordinary work. Then he looked at his grandmother. I know, he said. I've been thinking about nothing else for the last 20 minutes. The auction was held in June, for months after Dolores first turned the iron key in the padlock. The 12 pieces James Whitfield had selected were transported to a specialist auction house in Houston that handled American craft and decorative arts. Each piece documented with full provenance, each one accompanied by photographs of the basement workshop and pages from Dolores's research into August Reyes's life. Dr. Chen wrote the catalog essay. He had offered to do it without being asked, calling Dolores on a Tuesday morning to say that he had been thinking about August Reyes since his visit to the factory and that he wanted, if she would allow it, to tell the story properly. He said that the story was not just about the furniture. It was about a man who understood that his work had value even when the world around him had organized itself to pretend otherwise, and who had acted on that understanding with 30 years of absolute commitment. He said that was the kind of story the furniture world needed to tell and almost never did. Dolores said she would allow it. The catalog essay ran to 8 pages. It began with August's father's hands. It ended with Dolores's $3. The auction room in Houston was fuller than James Whitfield had anticipated. Word had moved through the craft and design community with the particular speed that genuine discovery produces, the urgent lateral circulation of people who have been told there is something they need to see and have found that the claim was not exaggerated. There were collectors from New York and Chicago and Los Angeles. There were museum curators from 4 institutions. There were journalists from 2 design publications and 1 general interest magazine that had decided, correctly, that this was a story its readers needed. Dolores sat in the second row with Marisol on one side and Cleo on the other. She had worn her good dress, the dark blue one she kept for occasions that deserved it. She had her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her face arranged in the calm, attentive expression she brought to everything that mattered. The first piece went to a collector from Chicago for $48,000. The second went to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston for $62,000. By the 6th piece, the room had understood what it was witnessing, and the bidding had taken on the particular energy of people competing not just for objects, but for their place in a story they recognized as significant. The auctioneer, a composed professional woman who had been doing this for 20 years and had developed a reliable immunity to drama, allowed herself one small raised eyebrow at the paddle numbers. The 12th and final piece, the roll-top desk with its perfect working mechanisms, sold to a private collector for $114,000 after a bidding sequence that lasted 11 minutes and involved 4 separate bidders who had each, apparently, decided that this was the piece they could not leave without. The total for the 12 pieces was $641,000. Dolores sat in the second row and listened to the final number and did not change her expression. Cleo pressed her hand briefly. Marisol exhaled beside her with a long, slow breath that she had clearly been holding for some time. Afterward, in the reception the auction house hosted in the adjoining room, people came to speak to Dolores with the specific quality of attention that is given to someone who has just demonstrated that they understood something important before anyone else did. She was gracious and brief with all of them, answering questions about August Reyes with the precision of her 3 weeks of research, deflecting questions about herself with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent a lifetime being underestimated and had learned that invisibility has its uses. A curator from a museum in San Antonio, a young woman named Elaine who had the focused energy of someone in the early years of a vocation she had chosen completely, asked Dolores whether the remaining collection would ever travel, whether there would be loans to other institutions, guest exhibitions, a broader presentation of August's work beyond the permanent home in the factory. Dolores said she had not ruled it out. She said the primary thing was to give the work its proper home first, in the building where it had been made, in the neighborhood where August Reyes had lived his life. She said she believed there was something important about that, about the work remaining in relation to its origin rather than being dispersed into the general cultural market where provenance becomes a footnote and context gets quietly lost. Elaine looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Are you an educator?" Dolores said no. She said she had been a woman who kept a kitchen garden and raised 2 daughters and attended to the things that needed attending to for 60 years. Elaine said, That sounds like education to me. Dolores allowed herself a small smile and moved on. The renovation began in September. Tomas had prepared the architectural plans over the summer, working evenings and weekends with the focused intensity of a man who had found the project his professional life had been building toward without his knowing it. He had brought in a structural engineer he trusted, a colleague named Reeves who examined the building's bones and confirmed what Dolores had seen from the parking lot on that first February morning. The construction was honest and solid. The foundation was sound. The roof needed replacement, but the walls needed only repointing. The building had been waiting with patience and good structure for someone to come back to it. They worked through the autumn and into winter. Dolores came every morning. She did not pretend to supervise in the technical sense. She walked the space each day and watched it change and made decisions when decisions were hers to make and deferred when they were not. She brought the good thermos. She learned the names of every worker on the crew. One of them was a young man named Diego, 19 years old, from the neighborhood 6 blocks east of the factory, whose grandmother had worked a sewing machine on the production floor for 11 years before the closing. He had been hired through a workforce program that Tomas had connected with, the kind of program that existed in the gap between what young people from certain neighborhoods were expected to do and what they might actually be capable of. Diego was quiet and observant and had the careful hands of someone who paid attention to physical things. He had been assigned to general labor, but Dolores had watched him for 2 weeks before asking Tomas to move him to the Finnish carpentry team, where the crew leader, an experienced craftsman named Leon, had looked at the boy's hands and his attention and agreed without argument. By December, Diego was doing detail work that Leon reviewed and approved without correction. Dolores did not comment on this to anyone except Cleo, to whom she said one Thursday evening. August Reyes learned from his father and his grandfather. Someone has to be the next link in that. Cleo said, "You're going to offer him a spot in the school. When it opens," Dolores said. Yes. The gallery space on the production floor was completed in February, exactly 1 year after Dolores had first pushed the door open with the iron key. Tomas had designed it with the precision and the humility that the space deserved, keeping the bones visible, keeping the brick and the original flooring and the mural, which a conservator had spent 6 weeks stabilizing and cleaning until the painted workers stood clear and dignified against their wall again. The horizon in the upper corner of the composition now visible in a way it had not been under 30 years of grime. The remaining furniture was moved from the basement in stages, each piece documented and positioned according to a plan that Dolores and Dr. Chun and a museum installation specialist had developed together over several weeks of conversation and disagreement and eventual resolution. The pieces were arranged not as a formal museum collection, with rope perimeters and enforced distance, but as a lived-in space, the kind that invited a person to understand what it might feel like to be in a room where these things belonged. Chairs that could be sat in, tables where the grain could be touched. The roll-top desk was not there, having gone to its collector in Houston, but in its place a photograph of it, life-sized, printed on archival paper, with its catalog entry and its sale price and the name of the buyer who had competed 11 minutes to own it. The basement workshop was preserved exactly as it had been, August's tools on their hooks, his workbenches clean and ordered, the dates carved into the undersides of pieces noted on small brass plaques that Dolores had commissioned from a metalworker in the neighborhood. A short written history of August Reyes was mounted near the entrance to the basement stairs, in both English and Spanish, written by Dolores herself after 3 drafts that Patricia had helped her refine. It began with his father's hands and ended with the word home. The upper floor opened 6 months later as the Reyes Workshop, a name Dolores had chosen without deliberation because it was simply the right name. It offered instruction in furniture making, woodworking, and traditional joinery, subsidized on a sliding scale so that cost was not the determining factor in who could attend. The first cohort was 12 students. Diego was among them. So was a 58-year-old woman named Concepcion who had been a seamstress for 30 years and whose hands, her instructor said after the first session, already understood tools in a way that most students needed months to develop. Dolores attended every first session of every cohort. She did not teach. She sat in the back and watched, and said nothing unless someone asked her something directly, in which case she answered with the precision and brevity that had characterized everything she said her whole life. After the third cohort, One of the students, a young woman who reminded Dolores slightly of herself at that age, asked her in the break between sessions why she had started the school. What had made her think of it? Dolores considered the question. She thought about August Reyes working alone in the basement for 15 years, surrounded by extraordinary work that no one knew existed. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge and the shape of that compliment. She thought about Ernesto driving past the building every morning and thinking of her. She said, because the world is organized to make certain kinds of work invisible while depending on it completely. And because the best answer to that is not to argue with the organization. The best answer is to make the work and teach the work and put it somewhere it can be seen. The young woman wrote that down. The opening reception for the August Reyes Gallery was held on a Saturday evening in March, 15 months after the iron key had turned in the padlock. It was not a grand event in the sense of scale or spectacle. Dolores had been deliberate about that. The invitations had gone to people who had a genuine connection to what the space represented, former workers from the factory and their families, the members of the restoration crew, the students from the first and second cohorts of the Reyes workshop, the researchers and curators and specialists who had contributed to the understanding of August's work, the neighbors who had watched the building's transformation through the autumn and winter, Cleo, Patricia, Dr. Chun, James Whitfield, Elaine. From the museum, Tomas and his structural engineer, the auction house director from Houston who had called Dolores after the June sale to say it was the most meaningful auction he had conducted in 20 years. And Ophelia, the former seamstress who had worked 2 stations down from August Reyes for 17 years and who had seen his car in the parking lot one morning 3 years after the closing and had not known what to make of it and had not thought about it again for 40 years until a phone call from an 82-year-old woman with a yellow legal pad had given her a reason to. Dolores had sent Ophelia a car, not a taxi, a car with a driver she knew, a man from the parish who was reliable and kind, with instructions to take Ophelia wherever she needed to go that day before bringing her to the reception and taking her home safely afterward. Ophelia was 84 now and did not drive, and Dolores had decided this without consulting anyone because it was simply the right thing to do, and she was 82 years old and had no patience left for the alternative. Ophelia arrived early, before most of the other guests, and stood in the gallery for a long time without speaking. She moved slowly through the space, stopping in front of each piece with the particular attention of someone who was recognizing something they had not known they remembered. When she reached the mural on the east wall, restored now to its full clarity, the painted workers standing clear and dignified at their stations, she stopped and stayed stopped for long enough that Dolores came to stand beside her. Ophelia pointed to a figure in the middle distance of the mural, a woman at a cutting station, her hands positioned over fabric in a way that was entirely specific, a particular grip that a person who had done that work would recognize immediately. That's Maria Elena, Ophelia said. She worked the station next to mine for 12 years. She died in 2015. Dolores looked at the painted figure. She thought about the unknown painter, about the care that had gone into recording each individual figure, into making the work visible on the wall of the place where the work was done. She thought about August Reyes 1 floor below, making his own record in wood and joinery, his own argument about what hands were capable of, his own refusal to accept that the closing of a building meant the ending of what mattered. She said, "Do you know who painted it?" Ophelia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I do. There was a man who worked in the shipping department. He painted on weekends. He used to paint the other workers sometimes, little portraits. People kept them. I had one for years before I lost it in a move. Do you remember his name?" "Manny," Ophelia said. "Manuel Serrano. He went to work at a printing company in Austin when the factory closed. I don't know what happened to him after that." Dolores took out the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket and wrote the name down. Manuel Serrano. Austin. Printing. Another thread to follow. Another piece of the building's story waiting to be found. That was the thing about this place, she was learning. Every question answered revealed the shape of the next one. Every layer of understanding uncovered produced another layer beneath it. The building had been holding more than furniture. It had been holding the accumulated specificity of hundreds of lives, the particular details of people who had come every day to do work the world had organized to overlook, and who had left traces of themselves in the walls and the floors and the painted surface of the east wall and the joinery of chairs that had waited 30 years for someone to come and look properly. She would not live long enough to find all of it. She knew that. She was 82 years old and realistic about the arithmetic of things. But she could start the finding, and she could build the place where the finding could continue after her. And she could teach the young woman who had written down her words in the Reyes workshop that visible work and invisible work were not different in their worth, only in who had been paying attention. Derek Patterson came in April. Not Derek Patterson specifically, but the type, which in Dolores's experience was more instructive than the individual instance. His name was Glenn Harbor, and he represented a development group that had been watching the industrial corridor where the factory sat with the particular patience of people who understand that neighborhoods change and that the early position is the profitable one. He arrived at the gallery on a Tuesday afternoon when Dolores was there alone, reviewing installation notes with the building's facilities manager, and he came in with the ease of a man who was accustomed to entering spaces as though they already belonged to him. He introduced himself and said his firm was interested in the property. He said the neighborhood was changing and that the building, though he could see that significant work had been done, was sitting on land that would be worth considerably more in 3 years than it was today. He said his group was prepared to make a strong offer, that they appreciated the cultural work that had been done, but that ultimately a building of this size in this location had a highest and best use that he was confident they could help realize. Dolores let him finish. She had the particular patience with this kind of speech that comes from having heard its essential shape many times before, in many rooms, from many men who had organized their confidence around the assumption that the person they were speaking to needed what they were offering. Then she said, "The building is not for sale." Glenn Harbor nodded in the way of a man who has been told this before and considers it an opening position rather than a conclusion. He said he understood that these decisions took time, that the offer would be generous, and that she should feel no pressure. He left a card. Dolores put the card in the folder she had labeled correspondence and closed the folder and went back to her installation notes. She did not think about Glenn Harbor again except once, briefly, on the drive home, when she thought about the county assessor's man who had laughed when she signed the transfer document. She thought about how the laughter of people who were certain they understood the value of things was, in her experience, one of the more reliable indicators that they did not. $3, she thought. And what those $3 had become. She did not think about it with triumph. She thought about it with the particular quiet satisfaction of a person who had looked at something carefully and understood it correctly and acted on that understanding without requiring anyone else's confirmation first. The first anniversary of the gallery's opening was marked not with an event, but with an addition. Dolores had spent the winter working with Patricia and a graphic designer on an archive, a physical one, housed in a series of flat files in the former foreman's office, which had been kept and restored as a room within the gallery, its desk and its calendar and its particular atmosphere preserved under the additional layer of the documentation it now contained. The archive held everything Dolores had gathered about August Reyes, every record and interview note and photograph, alongside the documentation of the factory's full history, the workers' names recovered from union records and personal memory, and the parish directories of 3 churches in the neighborhood, the oral histories recorded by a graduate student Patricia had connected her with, who had spent 6 months interviewing surviving former workers and their families. Manuel Serrano had been found. He was 78 years old and living in Austin, retired from the printing company after 30 years, still painting on weekends. He had driven down in October with his daughter and stood in front of the mural for a long time, and then sat with Dolores in the foreman's office for 2 hours and told her everything he remembered about painting it, about the workers he had known and what he had wanted to say about them, and why he had thought the wall of the factory where they had worked was the right place to say it. He said, "I painted it for them to see, not for anyone else, just for them to look at when they were working and know that someone had seen them doing it." Dolores had written that down and added it to the archive. On the morning of the first anniversary, she came to the building before anyone else arrived, unlocked the padlock, pushed the door open, and stood for a moment in the entrance the way she had stood on that first February morning a year and 3 months ago. The light was different now. The boarded windows were gone, replaced with glazing that let the morning in from the east in long, warm angles across the production floor. The mural stood clear on the east wall, Maria, Elena, and the others at their stations, the painted horizon visible above them. The furniture in the gallery caught the light in the particular way of wood that has been worked with absolute attention, each surface a record of the hand that had moved across it. Dolores walked to the basement stairs and went down. The workshop was as it had been, tools on their hooks, workbenches ordered. She sat on the stool at the primary bench, the one where August had worked facing the south wall, and looked at the space around her. She thought about him sitting in this same spot at the end of a day's work, the piece he had been making complete or nearly complete, his tools cleaned and returned to their places. She thought about a man who had understood that the closing of the factory above him did not mean that the work was finished, who had come back every day with his tools and his wood and his complete commitment, and had made 37 years of invisible extraordinary work in a basement that the world had decided was worth $3. She thought about Ernesto saying she had the right kind of eyes. She thought about her father crossing the border with ruined hands, and her mother crossing it with a child on her back, and the stubborn belief that what they built would matter. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge and the shape of that compliment, and all the things she had done with. The engineer's mind that had surprised a sixth-grade teacher in 1954 that had nothing to do with engineering in the formal sense, and everything to do with it in the essential one. She thought about $3, and what $3 can be if the person holding it knows how to look. She was 82 years old. She had a kitchen garden and a good thermos and a building she had paid $3 for, and a basement full of masterpieces, and a gallery where they could be seen, and a workshop where young hands were learning that the work had always been worth doing, and a foreman's office full of names that had been recovered from the place where they had been almost lost. She had a notebook with Manuel Serrano's words in it. I painted it for them to see, not for anyone else, just for them to look at when they were working and know that someone had seen them doing it. She had Cleo next door and Marisol on Thursday evenings, and Tomas, who had found the project his professional life had been building toward, and Diego, who was doing detail work that required no correction, and Ophelia, who had pointed to Maria Elena on the wall and given her a name. She had the iron key, which she kept in her coat pocket every day now, not because she needed it, the building had a modern lock, but because it was the right kind of weight to carry. The kind that reminded you of what you had come from, and what you had found, and what the finding had cost, and what it had been worth. Dolores picked up the iron key and held it in her palm. The cold of it warmed slowly in her hand the way cold things do when someone holds them long enough and carefully enough. She had paid $3 for this building. $3 for the bones and the basement and the 30 years of hidden work and the mural and the mural's painter and the names in the archive and the school on the upper floor and the thread that led to the next thread and the next one after that. All of it there beneath the surface of a building the world had looked at and seen nothing, because the world had not been looking with the right kind of eyes. She put the key back in her pocket and stood and climbed the stairs back into the light. She had work to do, the kind that had always been worth doing, even when no one was watching. Especially then. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.